How are y'all doing? Not on.
Test.
Hello.
Can you turn that up just a little? Boy, it's really good to be here. I apologize for a while ago when my phone rang, but that is one, like I said, one time I wish that I had answered it because it was my grandson. And he's in Afghanistan and we worry about him all the time. But I know that he tried to make that phone call, so I know he was able to push the buttons, which is good. I normally don't do this, but I had somebody, oh, there we go. I thought I was going to do a wedding here for a second. I normally don't do this because I wasn't really sure anybody would be all that interested in it, but it's kind of amazing how things work. I had two people come up to me last week. They knew I was going to preach, and one of them said, "Will you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're up there all the time and we really don't know much about you." Well, thinking back, I really haven't said much about myself other than the jokes that I tell, which are mostly made up, and some of it's true, but it's hard to sort through what's really fact and what's fiction. So I thought, and then another one came up to me and said, "I heard that you had an alcohol problem at one time. Would you talk about that?" And I thought about it for a while, and I thought maybe I could tie that together with a sermon. So I just wanted to tell you that I was actually born in Nixa on June 21st, 1951, which was 62 years ago. And I grew up there at Nixa. Went to high school at Nixa. Went to school with my wife, Sandy. I was saved and baptized at Riverdale Baptist Church, just south of Nixa, whenever I was 12 years old. I've got a younger brother and a younger sister. They're each 2 years younger. My brother's 2 years younger. My sister's 2 years younger than he is. So I started hanging around with Sandy when I think I was 14 years old, isn't that right? And she was 13. And our first date was we went to a rodeo together. And we just started hanging around, and her dad thought I never went home because I was always at her house. And that's when I found out she was a good cook. And that's not the reason I married her, but I tell you what, it sure helps if your wife's a good cook. I know that. We got married February the 12th, 1972. And even though we've had some ups and downs, we've never had any serious marital problems. We've been married for 41 years. She told me one time that she thought about being a marriage counselor, and I told her, I don't know why you get the idea you'd make a good marriage counselor. You've only been married one time. And, a lot of people have been married 4 or 5 times. You'd think they'd make better marriage counselors because they've got a lot more experience in it. But anyway, she is right now the director of special education down in Nixa. She retired from Willard a couple of years ago as the director of special education there. And after, it was about a month after she retired, I came out on the deck and she was sitting out there crying, and I asked her what was wrong, and she said, well, she thought she'd retired too soon. That she had wasted, she felt like she might be wasting some of her talent and some of her education and her ability to help kids. And she said, on top of that, I'm tired of sitting around watching you work on old fiddles all day long, which is what I had started a business doing, was rebuilding old violins and fiddles. So she went back to work about a year and a half ago. She is planning on retiring in December. And I hope this time it sticks. So Anyway, I went to, after I got out of high school, I went to SMS for a couple of years, and then I went to Raleigh for 1 week. I came back home and asked, I don't know that you'd call it asking, but I think I begged her to marry me. I couldn't stand being away from her. I'd been away from her for 1 week, and that's all I could take. So we got married that following February, and we've been together ever since. We've got 2 boys. One of them was here last Thursday and preached. Our other son is, he's older, and he likes to drive race cars and have a good time and party. Our youngest son, a couple months ago, I preached out of Deuteronomy about how important it is to get your kids into church when they're young. And the first chapter of Deuteronomy talks about the Lord sending the Israelites into Israel, and they didn't go. He told them to go, and they refused. And he made them go out and wander around in the desert for 38 years. And you see, when I was given that order by God, I refused also. I didn't take my kids to church when I should have, when my oldest son was young. And God said, okay, you can wander around in the desert for another 30 years. And that's what happened. Now, my oldest son was saved about 4 years ago. But in that 30 years, it was a lot of heartache and a lot of anguish for my wife and I, wondering about where he was going to end up one of these days. On the other hand, our youngest son, we'd started taking him to church at a very young age, and he was saved when he was 6 years old. That was the one that was preaching here. I didn't mean to preach that. I'm not preaching that tonight. I need to stay on track here, because I'm real bad about chasing rabbits. I'll start down this path and I see a rabbit go that way, and the next thing you know, I'm after it and I forget what I was supposed to do. Anyway, when I grew up, things were a lot different than they are now. There weren't any drugs. Alcohol was not really a problem that I knew of, back then when I was in high school. I mean, there were kids that drank, but not very many. I graduated from Raleigh with a degree in civil engineering and went to work at City Utilities. I got my license, got my engineering license, and I worked there for 31 years. And I started out as an engineer in the water department and ended up being the director of electric, gas, and water by the time I retired. Now, during all this time, I did every stupid thing you could possibly imagine. I remember a time whenever I was about 6 years, this is how I did things when I was a kid. My dad raised sheep when I was a kid, and I like to throw rocks at them, because then they'd chase me. We had a ram out there that was really good at chasing you down. So anyway, I'd throw rocks at him, and I kept him so pestered and so mad all the time that any time I went out in the field, the first thing he tried to do was knock me down. Well, he trapped me out in the barn one time, and I decided, I'll tell you what, I'm going to get back. It was probably 200 feet from the barn to the fence, and I thought, I'll outsmart that sheep. So there was an old feed sack laying there, and I just picked the feed sack up and I started pulling on it till I got me a couple eye holes in it. I put that feed sack over me, and I went out the door and headed for the fence. Well, that old ram was a lot smarter than I figured he was, because I hadn't made it about 10 feet and he knocked me down. Well, there I was in that feed sack, and I couldn't figure out where he was at. And every time I tried to get up, he had knocked me down again. And I finally got out of the sack and started running for the fence, and I still got a scar on my leg from where he hit me in the rear end and knocked me over the fence, and I got cut up on the barbed wire. I was always doing things like that. I was carrying a 12-gauge shotgun and a 30-06 when I was 12 years old. Well, people would panic if they saw a 12-year-old kid carrying a gun these days. I mean, it really is. You see it on the news all the time, but back then it didn't matter. Whenever I started working, I remember the first job I had was cleaning suckers at Sucker Day. We got a nickel a piece to clean fish. And man, I tell you what, I haven't been back to sucker day since I graduated from high school. I hate suckers. But I know how to scale fish anyway. Because you had to scale them. But, you know, we did crazy things. My two brothers-in-law and I, we took a float trip one time right after a big snow melted down the Finley River, and we turned our canoe over after we'd gone about a quarter mile and had another 6 or 7 miles to float, and it was February, and we just had a big snow melt. We were paddling down the river with sticks sticking up with all of our clothes on them. We were sitting there in our underwear, and we were so blue we looked like Smurfs going down the river. But you know, I threaded pipe for my dad until I was 16 years old, and I hated threading pipe. He had a plumbing business. I finally got me a good job washing dishes at the Heritage Cafeteria, so I wouldn't have to thread pipe anymore. But then when I got into college, I started working as a carpenter, and I thought, man, that is the job I like. And when I went to work at City Utilities, it was funny how this worked. I had a couple of job offers from other places I didn't want to go. So I came back to work in Springfield as a carpenter, and I applied at City Utilities, and I don't remember what day of the week it was. I just remember that at noon that day we were going on strike as a carpenter, and I had a guy from CU, the guy who was their employment, he was in charge of the employment part of it. His name was Carl Jacobs, and he talked kind of funny. Mary, you remember him. You do too, Keith. Anyway, he called me up and he said City Utilities was prepared to offer me a job, and would I be willing to accept it? And we kind of argued back and forth about money for a little bit, and I agreed to take the job. And he said, well, when can you report to work? And I said, well, I can be there at 1. This was about 11. He said, I can be there about 11. I said, I can be there about 11 o'clock. And he said, well, wouldn't you like to give your current employer 2 weeks notice? And I said, well, Mr. Jacobs, we're going on strike at noon. I'm going to be unemployed, so it doesn't matter. So he sent me down to get a physical that afternoon from a doctor named Dobler. And I went in, and now this was back when doctors smoked in their offices. And he's giving me a physical, and he tells me to drop my pants, so I do. He's checking me for a hernia. And when I look down at my underwear to pull them up, there's about that much cigarette ash laying in my underwear. So, you know, it's amazing how much different things are now than they were when I was growing up and when I was younger. That was 40 years ago. But I taught Sunday school for a while. But I ended up getting mad at the church, and we left because over some things that, anyway. But in that time period, I don't know when it started, don't know when it got bad, but I developed a drinking problem. And, you know, I always thought my problem was I just didn't have enough time to drink. And I used to play the fiddle, and I thought I was pretty good at it, but then I found out I was just drunk all the time and didn't know the difference. And over a period, this went on for about 30 years, and I praise God that I had a wife that put up with that for 30 years. Because a lot of women wouldn't put up with it. She didn't gripe at me, she didn't browbeat me. But during that time, the Lord started working on me. And I didn't know that. You know, I was saved when I was 12. But then I did what a lot of people do. I did what the prodigal son did. I wandered away from God. I didn't like the things that I was going to have to do. And like the father and the prodigal son, you know, if you read that story, which if you haven't read it, you really need to read it, because there's so many things going on that you have to really pay close attention, because Jesus packed so much into that story in so few words that it's just hard to visualize it all. But There's one concept in there that for a long time I didn't get, and that was this. You know, the Father didn't go get the Son. Most of us today would go drag our son out of that pig pen. But you know what? God knew that if he drug him out of that pig pen, he would go right back to it. And that's what I would have done. God knows, and we need to understand that if you're in that pig pen, God's going to leave you there till you're ready to come out, till you want to come out. Because and we need to apply that with our kids too. When they get into trouble, when they get into that pig pen, do what the Father did. Don't go drag your kid out. They'll go right back. You know what I'm talking about. You have to let them stay. That is the hardest thing in the world. I've learned that with my own family. They learned it with me. You cannot pull somebody out of that pig pen, but what they won't go right back into. But God knows, and God will test you, and he'll let you stay there until you want to come out. Until you ask him, till you come back and say, just let me be a servant. I'll do anything you want. I got to be that way. I knew my drinking was a real problem. And it bothered me. But there wasn't a thing I could do about it. That's what a lot of people don't understand. They'd say, just quit. Well, I got news for you. You can't just quit. And whether it's a disease or not a disease, I don't know. But I do know this. And the amazing thing is Alcoholics Anonymous learned this, and that is you can't do it without other people, and you can't do it without the Lord's help. I guarantee you. Amen. You know, the worst fights I ever had with my wife were when I was drinking. And I just thought at the time, man, if I wasn't married, my life would be great. I could just drink all the time and nobody would bother me. But that's not the way it is. Somebody would have bothered me. There would have always been a problem. I would have been in jail. But my wife really helped save me. You see, I started praying for God about 10 years before I quit drinking. I started praying for God's help. I started praying, Lord, I want to stop drinking. I want you to help me quit. Well, really what I want you to do, Lord, is make it where I can drink just a couple beers a day. Man, I'd be happy. Everything would work out just good, really good. But he knew that wasn't how it works. When you're an alcoholic, you can't drink one drink a day. You can't drink any drinks a day because it just makes you want one more. And that was the problem I was faced with. I could quit for a day or two and go right back to drinking again. And I finally figured out the problem wasn't that God wasn't helping me. God was letting me stay in that pig pen until I decided I wanted to come out. My problem was I was asking him to get me out, but I didn't want out of the pig pen. I just wanted out of the problems that it caused being in there. So I finally realized that maybe I'm asking for the wrong thing. Maybe I need to ask God to get me out of this pig pen. And the only way I was going to be able to do that was to tell him, Lord, fix it where I don't like to drink. Make it where alcohol doesn't taste good to me. And I know after all the stories I've told you that you're going to think I'm standing up here making this up, but I'm not. My wife will tell you. After a couple of days of praying that prayer, I had gotten where I was drinking earlier and earlier in the day. Because I never drank at work. That was one thing that probably saved me. But after I retired, there was nothing to keep me from doing what I wanted to do. Sandy was at work all day, and I just do what I wanted to. So noon, I'd open a beer, or 10 o'clock, or whatever. And I remember I opened that bottle of beer, and I took one drink of it, and it made me sick in my stomach, and I spewed it all over the place. And I thought, that's not right. Beer's always settled my stomach whenever I was having a problem. So I took another drink, and it made me sick again. So I thought, man, there's something wrong with this beer. So I went and opened another one, and it did the same thing. And so I thought, man, I'm coming down with something. So I just threw it away and didn't do it. I just didn't drink anymore that day. Never said a word to Sandy about it. The next day I get up. I can't wait to have my first beer. Same thing happened. Made me sick in my stomach. In fact, that time, it made me sick in my stomach before I ever took the drink. As soon as I smelled the beer, I got sick. And I thought, man, I don't know what's happening, but I still kept praying for God to fix it. And to fix it where I didn't like beer, but I was still trying. And the Lord was still working. And He won. Because after about 3 days of that, I quit trying. I gave up. And I got out of that pig pen. About 2 weeks later, I don't know if you've ever been where you're about to laugh and about to cry at the same time, but I was about to laugh and cry just at the same time. I'm not sure how you do that, but you can. About 2 weeks later, Sandy says, have you had anything to drink lately? And I said, no. She said, did you quit? And I said, I don't know. But I told her what had happened, and she started crying. Now, I think she had been praying all this time, too. And she asked me, she said, well, do you think you'll start again? And I said, after what God's done, I think if I started drinking again, it would be like slapping Him in the face. Because I truly believe that God fixed me. He did something that I could never do myself. And I've always wanted to have so much Jesus in me that if a mosquito bit me, he'd fly away singing "There's Power in the Blood." That's how much. That's the way we need to be. We need to have faith in Jesus. What time is it?
9 o'clock.
10 till? It's 9 o'clock.
No.
Tell me when it's about a quarter after. No, I'm serious. I always have way too much to preach about because
No, you don't.
it's easy to get, once you start preaching, it's easy to just let the Lord put the words in your mouth. And I don't know if you noticed it, I went over there once and looked at my notes about so I'd know when I was born, and that's about it. The rest of it comes. I told Scotty, believe it or not, this is not what I intended to preach about tonight. I had actually intended to preach about growing faith, how you grow your faith. Because Matthew 9:29 says, according to your faith it will be given to you. And this is basically a law that God's established, and it's a law of expectations. You see, usually you see what you expect to see and you hear what you expect to hear. You feel what you expect to feel, and you accomplish what you expect to accomplish. And if you know that God's on your side, and you truly believe that, and you have faith in what He can do for you, you can do just about anything. You can accomplish just about anything. I never thought I would have ever quit drinking. But God did that, because I kept asking Him for help. And I finally figured out that He was using, He tests you all the time. And the way He tests you are 4 ways. There are 4 Ds. Difficulties, demands, dollars, and delays. And I think the way He was testing me was difficulties, because of what was going on in my life. He was putting a lot of difficulties in my life, testing my faith. And He was also testing me through delays. He was leaving me in that pig pen He knew when the right time for me to come out was. I didn't. And if you've got, let me tell you, if you've got kids that or parents or brothers and sisters who are in that pig pen right now, all I can say is leave them there. Because if you pull them out too soon, they'll go right back in it. You've got to let God work on them, and you've got to let them decide now's the time for me to come out. Because if they don't want to come out, they'll go right back.